So my area of interest is assessment for learning in the second language classroom. And just to situate us, I don't want to take too much time here because I have a number of slides. I'd like to show you, it's really, assessment for learning is really a sort of fine-tuned formative assessment. So the definition of formative assessment that I like to use is that of an article that I and my co-author wrote and published in 2007, which you can read. And we like this one because it draws on several sources: Bachman, Lynch, and the Assessment Reform Group, who promote assessment for learning in England. So it's quite comprehensive. So really, basically, the interest is in how formative assessment and assessment for learning can situate where the students are in their learning and to help them to know how to move on and go to where they are. So it's a little bit like diagnostic assessment. So assessment for learning, just to give you a bit of background, came really from Black and Williams' 1998 work, in which they studied 250 educational studies where gains were made, and found that the real main, they summarized them in these 8 studies, but of the 250 they found, as they say here, that really the main contributing factor to raising the standards was formative assessment, they found overall. I don't think they started out looking for that, but this was really groundbreaking and had a big influence on British educational policy after that. So just to give you an overview, since in 1998 there were studies, there are more, but these are the really important studies on assessment for learning. In the general education literature, there was quite a lot. There were many more than I've put here, but these are some kind of key studies. But in second language education, there was very, very little. And then a little bit later, we see now there's a bit of a catch-up here. And in our study, for example, we looked at, as some of the others there have done, we looked at how second language classrooms should consider using this methodology, which was really brought out, which was really developed for maths and sciences initially. But I want to now tell you about 2 other things that are of interest to me in my research related to the assessment for learning approach. And that's the assessment bridge as one. That's the interlocking of assessment, teaching, and learning, where it's difficult to tease apart which one is going on in the classroom. Where assessment really drives learning and teaching is all involved in the objective of learning for the student, for the learner. And wait a minute, how do I go backwards on this? With the scroll, eh? Okay. The 2 things I wanted to mention in assessment for learning are the assessment bridge of interest, and also the idea Bachman introduced mostly of test usefulness. And that's an argument that we've illustrated here. This is from our article, where a deductive type of argument where you take evidence and try to see if a classroom practice, or in this case an assessment practice, is actually useful, so there's actual evidence to base it on, as opposed to many practices that are done just because of tradition, or because people say, well, lots of people do it, so it must be good, which is one thing I read in one article, which was highly criticized after. So those are the things that I'm interested in looking at. So now, for the application of assessment for learning in the classroom in my research, I'd just like to go a little bit further before I go into my particular research and say, so what is exactly assessment for learning? I've been talking about it, but just to go a little bit more in detail. It asks the learner to be very involved, to appropriate the goals of assessment, which formerly were the domain of teachers traditionally, and teachers alone, and in order to do this, to carry out self and peer assessments. And on the flip side, it asks teachers to encourage this and guide the learners with guided test questioning techniques and other techniques to give feedback that's useful, as opposed to just saying, well, that was wrong, as an example of an extreme. And then it's officially sanctioned where assessment for learning has been promoted by the states, that the teacher has much more flexibility in planning lessons. So assessment for learning, this is just to give you a nice picture, visual, has been mostly promoted in the UK and in Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Australia, Hong Kong more recently, and South Africa. So it's not so much here in Canada, although the reform in Quebec education has an element of that in it. Now, those were the 10 principles that have been promoted that really define assessment for learning in terms of the assessment reform group in King's College London in England. And so what they are here, I'll just show them to you. You may not agree with all of them. And I was very interested in my research in seeing how in a North American context and a Quebec context, because I do my research and live in Montreal, how some of these would be perceived. For example, this one, people usually have an opinion about this. AFL should be sensitive and constructive because any assessment has an emotional impact. You know, some people agree, some people say, well, I don't know. So that I was interested in seeing how these would play out in our context. All right, so just to move on. Okay, so in my research I was thinking, okay, I'm interested in assessment for learning, and I'd like to apply it in the classroom. In the work we did in 2007, I and Dr. Turner had investigated in a baseline study the formative assessment practices at a pre-university school of English for academic purposes, and we found there was an awful lot, a tremendous amount of formative assessment going on. But the assessment for learning approach wasn't exactly implemented because there were some aspects of it that weren't there. But the teachers and the students were, well, the teachers at the school and the administration, I should say, were very interested in an application of it actually in the classroom. So I was thinking, okay, we've got self and peer teacher assessments, scaffolding of knowledge. This comes from maths and sciences, where you learn one thing, then you learn the next and the next. And of course, second language education isn't like that. Guided questioning techniques to get the students to really be very active in thinking and coming up with answers and solutions, and more actively and dynamically learning. So this is an example of a question that the assessment reform group suggests teachers can ask at the start of a lesson, to just get students really taking responsibility more for their learning. Of course, this is a trend that's been around for a long time. Just this is sort of neatly packaged and interesting. And there have been great gains in maths and sciences of about a term. The students who do this are about a term ahead on average in high school math and sciences when they do the assessment for learning approach. And there's been similar gains elsewhere in other kinds of, in kindergarten students in the United States as well, where there was a similar study. So learners take more responsibility. There's a diagnostic assessment component to help determine, as I said earlier, where the learners are and where they're going and how they can get there. So my study is a mixed methods investigation of an application of AFL. So now I had to say to myself, all right, how am I going to apply this in a second language classroom? There's an interesting study by Hogden and Marshall where they compare AFL in maths and sciences and AFL in an English language arts classroom where a Shakespeare class is being taught. And they found similarities in the group work, but that AFL uses a lot for the peer work and peer assessment, but there were differences in the kind of questioning that were used. The scaffolding of knowledge that you do, in math is not the same as in a second language classroom. It's not like, okay, you've got the past tense, let's move on to the perfect. It's not quite, as we were saying earlier, learning isn't quite so discrete. So I thought of a methodology of taking all of these characteristics of AFL and applying it, and my population was the same population at the same school, so it was a pre-university English for academic purposes population of young adults, international students that were trying to pass the second language English test in order to begin their university careers. And I have a number of secondary research questions, which I'll explain as I go on. I don't think this is really a very useful slide, to be honest, because I'm going to explain what I did. I decided to use a computer-assisted learning component in order to get the students really engaged, to give them an opportunity to self-assess, to try to guide their learning, and because they're really interested in computers, being very young, to get them really involved in their learning and to take responsibility for their learning as is one of the tenets of AFL. I decided to use concept maps as a way of using AFL. So the students were going to be instructed to first do some computer-assisted learning. Then when they were prepared and really thinking about the issue at hand, which I'll tell you about in a second, they produce concept maps based on which help students to conceptualize with using diagrams and different kinds of visuals to conceptualize the point in question that they were grappling with. Now I'll stop here and say the point I looked at was a grammar feature, and I used grammar just because I thought they would be a very good vehicle for AFL. I'm really interested in the product. I know I can't look at uptake. I'm more interested in assessment and how it drives learning, so the process is what I wanted. Also, I wanted the students to be exposed to the possibility of changing their way about thinking about learning and taking responsibility for it. So the concept map was based on the grammatical point they were looking at, which was the use of when you use will and when you use would in unreal contexts. So you say, I would really like to win the lottery, but a lot of students produce that as I will really like to, and it's a real marker that really shows that at the advanced level that they haven't really they haven't mastered part of that difficult modal use. Thank you. So in my methodology, so the students had a module of computer-assisted learning, such as I just described. Then they had a group concept map. They produced a concept map individually. Then they produced a group concept map. I'll tell you more about this in a moment. And then as a class, they had a class discussion of the grammar point and created a class concept map, mostly student-driven, but the teacher was there to guide them along and help them to understand the grammar point and finally to give them pointers on how it worked. And after each step, I had the participants complete surveys talking about the perception of the usefulness of what they were doing, because coming back to the assessment bridges here and all of these things, and the usefulness aspect is there. So moving on, it's mixed methods, so I have quantitative data, pre and post tests. Although, as I say, I can't look at acquisition, I don't think in this kind of a study, but it's interesting to see if there are trends. It's more of a case study of this class and these students. I also gave them questionnaires on the 10 principles to see what they thought about that, and also the 2 teachers involved. I have frequency data as to how often they access the computer program. So I've explained this somewhat. Within the module, there was the self-assessment. There was an interactive quiz with hints they could click on to get a sense of how they were learning, if they were right or wrong, what about the target use. And then, as I've told you, they produced their concept maps, and then the group and the teacher. So the AFL components I mentioned are here. I think I'm repeating myself if I read them all out loud. In the end, the discussion was very interesting. I audio taped it, and I have I'll show you in a moment the resulting concept map that they came up with. It was very interesting because the students were first encouraged to say whatever they thought, and they came up with some very close approximations of the grammar rule, and also some erroneous ones, which really I encouraged them not to think of errors as bad, but to help them to learn. Although I wasn't teaching, but I told this in my training for the teacher, that's what I did. So in the piloting, it showed that that this methodology was working well, and these are the results of the pre-test, just to show they did pretty well when they were given a choice in a fill in the blanks of will or would, but they still had some difficulty with this issue. The teacher told me in advance that they had a very hard time with this. And then in an essay test where they were meant to more spontaneously produce the correct form, they had a lot of difficulty. Okay, so I'd like to show you just a bit of some examples of what I gave them to give you a sense of it. This is a module they did before the concept mapping to get them really ready for doing that part. And this is it's sort of like a chapter from a textbook, except it's online, and they go back and forth and they can correct and self-correct, and they're given the answers, and there are links to the different pages. There's a clue page. I think I reproduced it here. Well, I'm not sure. This is for self-assessment and for reflection. And you can see the theme is the mystery, like the idea that It's an English mystery, and grammar is a mystery in English. So that was the sort of theme I took. And yeah, this is the clues page. You're encouraged to either look at one or two things if they wanted, or come back to it, or read the whole thing. This is the more analytical people would read the whole thing. It's kind of complex. Some of them I said, don't worry if you don't want to be bothered reading all of it, that's okay. It's just there to help you depending on your learning style as well. Because Assessment for Learning also takes notice of learning styles, and learners are meant to be more responsible on their own, but also to work together. I mean, this is not a new idea, but it's the idea is interesting in that they really help each other to scaffold knowledge and to help each other to construct knowledge. So this is the quiz, my quizzical mystery I sent, with hints if you click on the question marks. And it's the hints are meant to guide them without telling them what the correct usage is. And I always put in some kind of difficult, ambiguous one so there would be discussion. It wouldn't be cut and dried. So for the concept mapping, if you'd like to see examples, I have some from the self-produced individual maps and the group and the teacher class. I have 3 examples from 3 students. This is what one student did in taking everything she or he had before and trying to figure out when to use will, when to use would. And they went through all of this treatment, but they were never told the answer till they weren't told the answer till the very end. And they were asking the teacher, and she'd say, "Oh, well, we'll see. Don't ask me." And they got actually quite interested in trying to figure out the mystery, which surprised me a little, and I was very pleased. So here's another one. Kind of complicated. This is with concept mapping educational software, and another one. Okay. It was interesting when they got in their group works, in their groups, because one or another student would say, "No, this is the only time you can say that," and then there was quite a bit of discussion. These are highly motivated students, as you can imagine, because they really want to get into university and pass their English test. So they were really engaged. They were all engaged, I found. Even those that were sitting more quietly, they were listening and offering suggestions. They had very good group work because they'd been working in groups previously quite a bit. So this student said in the class presentation she wanted to put a flower to make it more positive, and the rules had a little magnifying glass. So, and here's another one. Not sure. That was it. It was really nice that they weren't afraid to say when they didn't know and they weren't sure. That's another thing. AFL really is sort of it's as opposed to the way things used to be more traditionally in their worst case, AFL's like more, it's more of a blameless approach. It's like, it's okay to make mistakes and you can learn from them, so don't worry about that. Because it's not summative. We do have to have summative assessment, of course, but this is formative, so it's there to help. This is the 3rd group. And then as a class, this is what happened. The teacher stood at the front with an acetate on the overhead projector, and the students who had just presented their work, and I had big posters of their work so everybody could look at everybody else's work, and come together as a class to produce a concept map of when will and when would should be used. And then, see, they discussed this. They weren't sure, and the teacher gave them, in the end, she gave them an explanation of how she felt it should be used. So this is one of the comments that a learner made. Their comments were generally quite positive, very positive, really. And this is really hot off the presses because this data was collected last week. I got the last data last Friday, so it hasn't been analyzed yet. And so this is just these are preliminary results, so I haven't yet had a chance to go through them. That'll be the next step. Also, the data collection is halfway through. I'm going to be repeating this with another group, treatment group and control group, in the next month. Okay, so I'd like to thank the people who helped me, and also ACLA for travel. And since I'm a graduate student, and that's it.